All right, we're ready for Matthew chapter 19 in our study. If you need questions either for today or for next time, make sure that John Chick sees you. He has both. You tell him what you need, but raise your hand, make sure he sees you. We're going on with our study, Matthew chapter 19. We have before us the slides that we've been considering each time concerning the ministries of Jesus being divided up. And here we have plugging in the book of Matthew, and we're shifting gears this morning. By shifting gears, I mean that we have been dealing with the Galilean ministry that started in chapter 4, ends in chapter 18, and we're starting the latter Judean and Perean ministry. So that'll carry us through chapter 20, and we'll say more about that when we get through with chapter 20 next time. This is the outline that we're following from J. Sidlow Baxter. And we are obviously beginning a new section, as I just mentioned, as he presents it here. As we get into that latter Judean ministry, he calls this section the presentation, the honor as the king, and then we'll have his crucifixion. But this will include, as we get through chapter 25, his triumphal entry. We're not yet there. We'll get there a little bit later. All right. We're going to review our chapters as we did Wednesday night. We're going to hit and miss because we don't have time to cover all of these. Chapter 1 dealt with genealogy and the birth of Christ. Chapters 5 through 7 deal with Sermon on the Mount. Chapter 11. John sends messengers, and here's the invitation. Chapter 14. John beheaded. Now we'll come back to that a little bit later, at least just make an allusion to that a little bit later. Chapter 16. All right. Chapter 16 deals with the Peter's confession, and then we have the transfiguration in chapter 17, and then last week we dealt with relationships. All right, let's go to chapter 19 now. We have some ground to cover because of the subjects that are dealt with here, and we won't cover all of our questions, if any of those. But I'll try to answer those as we go along and flag those questions we're answering. 3 things happen in chapter 19. We have a discussion of divorce and remarriage in verses 1 to 12. We're going to subdivide that here in just a little bit. Having dealt with that, that's the primary thought. That doesn't mean that the rest of the chapter is unimportant, but when I think of chapter 19, what first comes to my mind is the discussion concerning divorce and the discussion concerning divorce and remarriage. That's a very important section. Then little children are brought to Jesus, perhaps connected with the previous discussion of verses 1 to 12. We'll talk about that possibility in a moment. Then 16 to 23 is the story that you know well of the rich young ruler. And so we hope to get through as much of that as we can. I want to particularly get to the end of that section. Now, if you look at verse 1 here, this is a dividing point in the book, and you might flag chapter 4 and in verse 12 as a connecting point about when Jesus had finished these sayings. A number of times it has been used, and I don't have those listed for you. Perhaps we will before we're through. But this is a dividing point in the book. As we've already suggested, he's leaving his Galilean ministry and headed toward his latter Judean ministry and making his way through Perea. Now, I put this map here to suggest to you, I want to notice at verse 1. Now, there's some question among students of the text as to whether this included Perea, but I want you to notice that he departed from Galilee, so he's ending the Galilean ministry, and he came to the region of Judea beyond the Jordan, generally thought to include, as they made their way down, generally the Jews would come through and would bypass Samaria for obvious reasons. And if that be the case, then most seem to think that he made his way into Perea, and that's where this discussion would have taken place before he gets into Jerusalem or into Judea itself. And so I've flagged this section as in part of this Perean ministry, as we've already alluded to. Now let's talk about divorce and remarriage. There's a lot of ground to cover, so bear with us. I think we need to get some principles out from this text and put some things in their context. Verse 3 said, now there was a great multitude followed him, and he healed many. But verse 3 says the Pharisees came asking a question. So let's give some historical background to what's going on. That'll help us understand what might be in the mind of the Pharisees. When the Pharisees come to Jesus and ask any question, it's never for a good purpose. It's always with an effort to try to entrap or ensnare or set him against someone else. This discussion takes place in the dominion of Herod Antipas, the very one who had beheaded John over a marriage issue. Some have surmised, and it is some surmising, that it's possible the Pharisees had in their mind, one man's head has already been taken off. If we can get him to commit to an answer, doesn't matter what it is, if we can get him upset or the people upset against him, maybe he'll lose his head. Was that the case? I don't know. Maybe. We'll just leave it at that. There were two major schools of thought on the cause of divorce centering around Deuteronomy 24. Now, we don't have time to go into a thorough discussion of Deuteronomy 24, though we need to talk about that in order to understand some things in the context. There were two major heads of two different schools of thought with reference to the interpretation of Deuteronomy 24. One of them said that divorce was only lawful for adultery or some sexual grounds. And they thought that Deuteronomy 24 was talking about that. It wasn't. There was another school of thought that said that passage is saying you could divorce your mate for any cause, every cause, even over salting or ill cooking the food. And that's not what Deuteronomy 24 said. They both were wrong. And so the discussion centered around which one of these, there was a third major, not a major, but there was a third kind of minor school of thought that we won't entertain, but these were not the only two, but these were the two major schools of thought with reference to divorce. Now, with that in mind, they came to him asking, what's their question? Verse 3. All right. So we have a question on number 2. And so in interest of time, the answer to that is the question that they asked was about divorce for any cause. We'll come back to that in just a moment. So the Pharisees' question was, can you divorce your wife for just any reason? Is that possible? Is that permissible? Now, they're not asking, Jesus, what is your law in contrast to Moses' law? They don't understand that, but Jesus will explain that in just a moment. They want to know, can a man divorce his wife just for any reason? Now, we'll come back to that. Look at 4 through 6. Jesus does not go to Deuteronomy 24 and explain Deuteronomy 24 just yet, but he goes where? To Genesis, to the beginning. So he points to God's law at the beginning and rebukes them for not having known that. Have you not read that he which made them at the beginning, made them male and female, and said, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and be joined or cleave to his wife, and the two shall be one flesh. They're no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. What I want you to see is Jesus was doing the same thing he did in Matthew 14 earlier, Luke 7, parallel account. And that is when in that case, when the disciples of John came to Jesus asking, are you the coming one, or do we look for another? He didn't answer yes or no, but he gave them evidence from which to draw their conclusion. Work miracles. Same thing here. Can a man divorce his wife just for any reason? He didn't say yes, no, but he gave them reasons from which to draw their conclusion, gave them the evidence. He gave 4 reasons. He said God created one man for one woman. He made them at the beginning, made them male and female. Secondly, a man must cleave or be joined to his wife. You can't cleave to your wife and divorce her for just any reason. They're one flesh. One is the only number you can't divide as far as people are concerned. And so they're one flesh. They're to be one, joined together as one. And then what God has joined together, let not man separate. So those 4 reasons Jesus answers is the answer to the question. Now we'll come back to what his answer was in just a second. But what I wanted you to notice is this was the answer that Jesus gave. He gave them 4 reasons to make the right conclusion. I want to pause for a moment, and let's go back, and you might make a marginal note if you can't remember this. The question was not about divorce and remarriage. The question was about divorce. Now, why is that important? Because some of our own brethren think that what Jesus is talking about is divorce if you intend to remarry. You can divorce for any reason, whatever you want to. But if you're intending to remarry, you can only divorce for the cause of fornication. They didn't ask that. They asked, can a man divorce his wife just for any cause? Their question was about divorce. Remarriage is not in the question just yet. Jesus will bring that up later, but not just yet. So the question is about divorce, not divorce and remarriage. And so his answer to that was, can you divorce for just any reason? And so his first answer to the question is, God created one man for one woman. What's the answer? Yes or no? No. He gave, you must cleave to your mate. What's the answer? Yes or no? No. He said a man is to be one with his wife. Answer, yes or no? No. And God has joined them together. What's the answer? No. You see, he gave 4 reasons, but his answer was no, 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 no. No. I think I had 4 there. Does that make sense? And so instead of like, well, why is that? He just gave 4 reasons. The answer is no. You don't divorce just for any reason. End of sentence. Now, is there a justifiable reason? He's going to get to that, but he hadn't got to that yet. Their question wasn't, can you divorce? But can you divorce for just any reason? His answer is no, 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 no. Interesting, Paul does the same thing in 1 Corinthians 7. No, 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 no. Gives 4 reasons there. All right. Now, let's move on. It was the Pharisees who brought up Deuteronomy 24. And so they ask about Moses and the bill of divorce. In other words, if that's be true, if what you're saying, they understood the answer to the question. If that's be true, then why did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce to put her away? Now notice, that's their wording. The Pharisees' wording. I don't trust them, do you? They're the ones who said this was a command to put her away. That wasn't Jesus. I trust Jesus when he talks about Deuteronomy 24 more than I do the Pharisees. All right, let's go further. He said, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, here's your word. King James will say suffered. The New King James will say permitted, allowed, in other words. You to divorce your wives, but from, that's what he just pointed to. God's law at the beginning. It was not so. All right, let's talk about Deuteronomy 24. See, what they were doing was attempting to put Jesus in conflict with Moses. If they can't get him in conflict with one of these rabbinical schools of Deuteronomy 24, maybe we can put him in conflict with Moses, and if he is, they're just trying to drum up support against Moses. They're not interested in the truth. So what does Deuteronomy 24 say? Well, this is Deuteronomy 24. We don't have time to analyze Deuteronomy 24 and get through much of the other chapter. But basically what Deuteronomy 24 is saying, it doesn't say you can divorce your mate for this cause. Many think that it does. It doesn't say that at all. What it says is when a man takes a wife and he finds some uncleanness in her, verse 1, and he gives her a divorce. Didn't say he should, but if he does do that, and she goes out of his house, verse 2, and she becomes another man's wife, and then later he hates her and he puts her away, verse 4, she cannot come back to her first husband. So here's how that law is structured. It's contingency law. Nothing was said to encourage divorce and remarriage. It's kind of an if-then instruction. That's clear, by the way, in the New American Standard translation, quite clear. That if he puts her away for uncleanness, whatever that may be, and she becomes another man's wife, and the second man puts her away or dies, then she cannot come back to the first husband. That's all Deuteronomy 24 had said. Never gave permission. Now, this was to discourage frivolous divorces. Now, let's talk about uncleanness just briefly. I really don't care what uncleanness is. Why would I say that? I'm not going to argue with somebody over what unclean. I could care really much, couldn't care a lot less about what it is. Why would I say that? All right, not supposed to divorce in the first place. We're not living under that law. And furthermore, God didn't give any approval, even in this text, as that being the cause. So I really don't care a lot about what it was. You say, I think I know. Okay, great. I really don't care. I know it wasn't adultery because she could be stoned for that. I know it wasn't suspicion of adultery. There was a test for that, Numbers 5. It was not that there was evidence that she was not a virgin. Deuteronomy 22 dealt with that. So that's not what it was. It seems to have reference to some flaw he found in her. That same word translated uncleanness is translated nakedness with reference to the land, a flaw in the land, Genesis 42. And so is that what it's doing? I don't know. But I think the text is saying, for some reason, God has not justified if he puts her away for some flaw he finds in her. What was the flaw? I don't know. But he finds some flaw in her, labeled as uncleanness. Should have been stoned if it was adultery, so it's something else. Moses suffered them to put away their wives. Now, let's talk about this word suffered or permitted. There's a difference in God commanding them. That's the word that they use, the Pharisees use. God didn't command this. And God allowing with approval and being allowed in the sense it was tolerated. So what's Deuteronomy 24? Is it saying God commanded divorce for uncleanness? No. Is it saying God allowed it with approval? Not a word said there. Is it saying God tolerated it? Yes. Making sense? All right. Now, I know we've got some ground to cover, so let's go to verse 9 now. Verse 9. Jesus says, and I say unto you, here's his law. We saw this construction back in chapter 5. Contrast to Moses, this is what I say. I say unto you, whoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery, and whoso marrieth her which is put away, doth commit adultery. Now, those who are following the New King James as I did, I just quoted the King James, and I prefer the wording of that. Not that this is wrong, I just think I like the wording of that. Now, there are a number of reasons why one might divorce their mate. They don't like them, he doesn't like the way she cooks, they can't get along, he spends too much money. You just name the reason. Jesus allowed only one. You won't find any other reason than fornication, Matthew 19:9 and 5:32. Does that make sense? Only reason that was ever justified. All right, let's learn something about divorce. I want you to follow with me because if you follow me here, I think you're going to clearly have an understanding of Matthew 19 and verse 9. And if that's as far as we get, we've done good. Look at Matthew 19, verse 9. Jesus makes a distinction in one who puts away their mate and one who is put away by their mate. You say, I don't see that. Well, let's see. I say unto you, whosoever shall, here we go, put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery, and whoso marrieth her which is put away. See, Jesus made a distinction in one who puts away their mate and one who is put away by their mate. So what we have are two sections, section A and B of our text. Section A is talking about the one who puts away their mate. Section B talks about one who is put away by their mate. Now, what do you learn from section A? Here's what I learned. The man, look at the top, the person who puts away their mate for the cause of fornication, when they remarry, they do not commit adultery. You say, where did you learn that? I learned it right here. I learned it right here in part A. That the one who puts away their mate commits adultery when they remarry, except when it's for fornication. All right? Let's back up, or go again. From that same section, I learned this. The man who puts away his mate for some cause other than fornication, when they remarry, they do commit adultery. You say, where did you learn that? I learned that not from part B, but from part A. Does that make sense? That's where I learned that. All right? Let's look at part B. What do I learn from it? The one who is put away, when they remarry, they commit adultery. And you say, well, where on earth did you get that? Let me back up. Here's where I got it, right here. I got it in part B of our text. I didn't learn that up here. I learned that down here. And so what have I learned from Matthew chapter 19 and verse 9? The one who has a right to remarry is one who's put away their mate for the cause of fornication. If they put away for some other cause, or if they are put away for whatever cause, they do not have the right to remarry. Simple as that. You say that's not fair? Take that up with the Lord. That's not me. Brother Gary Henry tells me the story of teaching on divorce and remarriage. and began a class one time and just read Matthew 19:9. Hadn't commented, hadn't explained it, just said, here's what the Lord said, read Matthew 19:9, and some brother raised his hand and said, that doesn't seem like a very good law to me. Well, the Lord said that. The Lord said that. Make sense? All right. Let's put that all in context. We could say more about Matthew 19:9, verse 3, verse 9, but the disciples have some question. So here's their response. Mark says they've moved into the house at this point, Mark 10 and in verse 10. And so they said, if such be the case with a man and his wife, it's better not to marry. In other words, they understood how stringent the law was. If this is the case, you'd be better off not to marry. And what was Jesus' response? Yeah, not everybody can, very good. Not everybody can receive this saying, and some can. In other words, there are some cases where it is better not to marry. But that's not a broad statement you just make. That's the point he's making. So what does he say? Well, look at verse 12. He mentions three classes: those who are born eunuchs, those who are made eunuchs by the cruelty of men, and more interesting for our discussion today is those who make themselves eunuchs for the kingdom. Who might that include per context? All right, some of the disciples, but as per context, the one who has no right to remarry are making themselves eunuchs for the kingdom. And you're right, some of the disciples did make themselves eunuchs in the sense that they chose not to marry. All right, make sense so far? And the one that's able to accept it, let him accept it. Now that's the context of Matthew chapter 19. Make sense? I know that's a hurried look at verses 1 to 12. We could spend 2 weeks just on verse 9. We could spend a lot of time just on verse 3, verses 4 to 6. But that's kind of an overview. That's what this survey is about. All right? So here's what we've learned from that. We've learned the question, can you divorce for any reason? Jesus said, no. You can't do that. Well, then, how does this mesh with what Moses said? Moses tolerated divorce, but from the beginning it wasn't so. Here's what I teach you, and here's his law on marriage, verse 9. The disciples said, well, it seemed like it'd be better not to get married. And Jesus said, well, in some cases that's true, but it doesn't apply to everybody. All right, let's move now to the little children being brought to Jesus. What happens here? All right. Yeah, look at verse 13. Little children, they brought him that he might put his hands on them and pray. That was not uncommon to bring your children to the synagogue or to a rabbi to have them to lay hands on them. There's no evidence that they were bringing these children to Jesus that he may lay hands on them to heal them. Nothing said about that in the context. Seemingly it was to bring them to Jesus that he may lay their hands on them, as was per the custom of bringing them to one of the Jewish officials, that he might bless them. Laying hands is used in a number of senses. Sometimes it's used in appointment to work, in blessing. Sometimes it's seizing a person, laying hands on them to seize them as arresting them. But here it seems to be laying hands in the sense of blessing them. And the disciples were ready to push them back. Now, but Jesus said at verse 14, let the little children come to me and do not forbid them, for of such is the kingdom. I want to talk about what that may or may not mean, and then I want to come back and connect it with the context. And after saying that, he laid his hands on them and departed from there. So it's a very short section. What does it suggest to you that of such is the kingdom? He said, let them come. Bring the children on. Let them come to me, for of such is the kingdom. Is he saying children, little infants are in the kingdom? Yes. Connect that with chapter 18. That's some evidence of how Jesus was thinking, and that is that you take on the nature of the little children, the innocence of children, the obedience, the submissiveness of children. This is the kind of people that make up the kingdom. Now, why is that thrown in here in this section? There's usually a reason, whether it's chronological, this is in the connection with what was going on, or by inspiration, Matthew is including it in a certain place. There's a reason usually for that. Sometimes we don't know. But it seems to me that this is a possibility. Some have suggested that the point being made is that if marriage is important, then children are important. If women, who are often viewed as unimportant, were just esteemed highly in the discussion of verse 9, rather than just be pushed aside as trash, but he couldn't put her away unless she committed fornication, then children also are to be hallowed or be revered and respected. That seems to make some connection. If that's not it, I'm not sure what the connection with the previous section would be. Does that make sense, JP? Good point. Yeah, they were not like little children. They were rebellious and unwilling to submit. We're going to see another example of that with the rich young ruler. Good point. Any thoughts? Threading verses 13 to 15 with 1 through 12, or maybe it's not supposed to be threaded. Maybe I'm trying to force it when it's not there. Good point, good point. Yeah, he had already cited the authority of the law at the beginning, and they just ignored that. They made no comment on that, ignored it completely. And we're going to see another case of ignoring here in the context. Same principle, yes. It involves obedience and submission. Good point. All right. If I can find my thing here. Let's talk about the rich young ruler now in verses 16 through 30. Let me go back, though, before we get to that. I think we have time to develop that. In case you're wondering on some of the questions, and I'm ignoring the questions in interest of time. Question number 3, the 4 reasons we've had on the screen before you already. Question number 4, if you don't have the answer to Matthew 19, distinguish between one who puts away and one who is put away. Question number 5, from Matthew 19:9a, we learn the one who puts away his mate for fornication does not commit adultery. And then question 6 is just the opposite. The one who puts away for some cause other than fornication commits adultery when he remarries. Question 7, Matthew 19:9b, we learn from it the one who is put away cannot remarry. All right, let's go to question number 8. This was a thought question. How could the rich young ruler keep so many commands and yet have a problem with this one? Good point. Seems to be that he was doing pretty much, there's some commands he has no problem with because they're convenient. They're not an inconvenience for him. Same thing with us. It may be doing this is not all that hard. I'll do that. That one's not too hard. But here's one that I struggle with and is not real convenient for me. I don't want to give up some things. That seems to be the case here. All right, let's get underway with the rich young ruler. In 16 to 22, he's not willing to do what he was told. Now, we can spend a lot of time, which we're not going to be able to. He come running to Jesus, saying, "Good teacher, what good thing shall I do that I might have eternal life?" So let's list some good characteristics concerning this man. Our first impression, this picture, if you're standing off to the side and you see this happen, he come running to Jesus. That shows some, Mark's account, I believe, mentions that. One of the accounts does. That here's a man seems to be eager, and our first impression, now we don't know anything about him, pretend, we don't know the end of the story, but we notice that he's interested in the spiritual by the very question. He's interested in eternal life. He wants to go to heaven. He seems to have concern for his soul. I saw that at verse 16. And he later says, when Jesus tells him to keep the commandments, and he said, "Well, I've kept all of those," that tells me that he has good morals. He'd kept the commands. He'd been consistent. He'd kept it from his youth up, had good training. And so I'm impressed, aren't you? He implies his parents had taught him, and so from my youth I've been keeping these commandments ever since. It's not like I fell off the truck there for a little while and I've just got back on. He didn't do that. He said, I've kept them from my youth up. I'm impressed with this young man, aren't you? Because here's a man who has wealth, he has power, and he has fame, and he's interested in the spiritual. He's the rich, young ruler. Has everything going for him. All right. Now, I want to look at verse 17. Jesus says, why do you call me good? There's none good but one. That's not a denial that Jesus is good. He's actually affirming that he is God, isn't he? In other words, it's a question. Why are you connecting me with good, a term that should be used with reference to God? There's none good but God. I think it's an affirmation of his claim that I am God. In other words, are you making that connection? He's saying to the rich young ruler. But be that as it may, Jesus tells him to keep the commandments. You are familiar with that. Verse 18 and 19, here's the enumeration of the commandments. And then the young man said, all of those I've done from my youth, what do I still lack? Now in verse 21, Jesus responds, telling him, if you will be perfect. Mark's account and Luke's account said there's one thing you lack. Not there's a whole bunch. There's 10 other commands you haven't kept. But there's one thing you lack. And what was it? Yes. Take what you have and sell it and give to the poor, and then you'll have treasure in heaven. You see, this rich man needed to give more than the poor needed to receive. And verse 22 said he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. In other words, he wasn't willing to do that. So here was a command that wasn't easy. Here was a command where he was not willing to make a change. He wasn't willing to give up the hindrance. He chose not to do anything, and so he walks away. So that tells me that these other commands must not have created a great hindrance. Honor your father and mother. Well, I've got money. I can take care of them. I can see they're cared for. Thou shalt not steal. Well, that's not hard because I don't need to steal. None of it was hard for him, but here's one that's hard, and so he let something get in his way. He went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. Now, that makes us want to raise this question. What would you do when you get an answer that there's this one thing you still lack? Just one. If you would make this change, you can go to heaven. Because that's what you ask about. That was your question. Here's the one thing. What would your answer be? Now, I want to see if we can get through the rest of this. The question then came up about who could be saved. So let's look at verse 23. Jesus said to his disciples, assuredly I say to you, it's hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. What's his point? Is he saying rich people can't be saved? All right. I think his point is this rich man, this kind of rich man can't be saved. There were rich people in the Bible that were godly people. Abraham, wasn't he rich? Job, wasn't he rich? Indications seem to be the Apostle John may have had some degree of wealth. He owned his own house. Then Jesus says, it's easier for a camel to go through an eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Some commentators, and you may have one that said, the eye of a needle is a narrow passageway. You get your camel, and he'll get stuck, but you keep pushing and shoving, he'll go on through. That's not what this is talking about. Matthew uses a term for a sewing needle. Luke uses a term for suture needle. It's a literal needle. So you women have got a needle at home, I don't care how big it is. Do you think you can ever get a camel to go through it? And you say, impossible. Bingo, you got it. That's his point. It would be easier to take a camel and shove it through the eye of that needle than for one with this attitude to go to heaven. It ain't going to happen. It ain't going to happen. All right, let's go further because we're driving to get to a point. So the disciples then are kind of taken back by that, and they raise the question, who then can be saved? Look at verse 26. He said, with men it is impossible, but with God all things are possible. I think what he's saying in verse 26 is the issue focuses on man's dependence upon God and his willingness to submit to God. The Pharisees obviously weren't earlier. The children were identified as those who would be submissive in chapter 18 in our immediate context. So with God, you turn to God, do what He says, and trust in God and do what God tells you to do, and it's possible. So God is not making it hard for the rich. It's the rich's greed that causes it to be hard for them. And so, here we go. Peter, always ready and bold to jump out. What does he say? In contrast, let me start paraphrasing. Peter seems to be saying, we are in contrast to that rich young ruler. We've left everything. And so, therefore, what shall we have? Seems to be a hireling spirit, doesn't it? What shall we have? All right. I didn't know if we'd have time to get to this. I wanted to drive to this because I think the beauty of how this flows in the context makes sense to me. Peter, that again seems to be a hireling spirit. The Lord's not too impressed with that question, I want to tell you. We have forsaken all. What are we going to get? We're not like Him. We're better than Him. We've made great sacrifice. What are we going to get? And so we can't go through every detail here, but let's look. 2 points seem to be made. Your reward, Peter, is yet future. Look at verse 28. Assuredly, I say to you that in the period of regeneration, when the Son of Man sits on His throne. So when Jesus is reigning on His throne in His kingdom, which is from Pentecost to the current day, that's the period of regeneration. That's also when the apostles will be sitting on the 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. In what sense? I think it's referring to the authority that the apostles would have. That during that period of regeneration, we're governed by the words that the apostles revealed. I think it refers to the authority. And that's all happening at the same time. So what he's saying, your reward is yet future. Meanwhile, Peter, what you need to be concerned with is following Christ. Now verse 29, that the one who's left houses and brothers and sisters and father and mother and lands for my sake shall receive 100-fold in everlasting life. Meanwhile, you need to be giving up all that's necessary to do so. So don't think you've made all sacrifice. You may have to make more sacrifices, Peter. Does that make sense? Your reward's yet future. Now, here's what you're going to receive in answer to your question, Peter. You're going to receive authority as apostles, verse 28. You're going to receive more than you sacrificed, 100-fold. And you're going to receive eternal life. But Peter, many who are first will be last and last will be first. You're not going to receive more than anybody else. That seemed to be what Peter was thinking. Does that make sense? In other words, Lord, I don't know if you've noticed, but we have made great sacrifice. I'm assuming we're going to probably get a little more than everybody else. Make sense? It ain't going to happen. But you are going to be rewarded. Make sense? Don't ever, and this may connect back with these little children, at least that attitude of little children, of being humble and be submissive. Don't ever think that, you know what, I've done a little more than other people. I'm looking around and I think I've made more sacrifice than anybody. I just know the Lord's got some special blessings for me. The Lord said, no, Peter. No. You got it all wrong. Make sense? A lot in chapter 19. Not a lot of time in our study because it's all just been spent. Chapter 20 next time.